Okay, I'm about halfway through grading everyone's papers, the first papers from the readings that we did at the beginning of the semester. And I just noticed some things that are sort of happening in most of the papers, and that's totally typical. That happens in every Comp 2 or Comp 1 class. You always have the same kinds of, I don't even want to call them mistakes, but they're just things that you're probably not used to doing. So I've sort of copied and pasted chunks of the papers, threw them into a PowerPoint, and thought I would talk through them a little bit. I haven't gone through everyone's papers, so I might have another PowerPoint or two later on in the week or even next week, but I figured a shorter video would probably be easier for you guys to go through. So, starting off, it's important when we're using quotes that we try to integrate them into our own writing, right? So you have an example of this here on the screen. I've bolded the introduction. So the village seems very normal and gives us this picture, colon. The children assembled first, of course, etc., etc. So the bolded text is the author of the paper writing this, and then inside the quotation marks, obviously, is the quoted material, right? And so the author has been able to combine the quote into his or her own writing, so that makes things move a little bit more seamlessly. And that's something that you want to go for. You can do it a bunch of different ways. This one uses a colon. You can use, the narrator says, comma, quotation. There are a bunch of different ways to do this, but this is one example. So that's one thing that this quote does pretty well. We can also tweak the parenthetical citation that comes at the end. So we have the same quote, just different parts of it bolded now. So when we get to the end of the quote, we see that we have the final word reprimands, a period, then the quotation marks, the close of quotation marks, and then S. Jackson 291. And think to yourself, what should the parenthetical citation look like instead of that? So we can go and take a look. Parenthetical citations include the author's last name without the initial and the page number. So we're going to cut the S out of here, so we have just Jackson 291, and then we need to relocate it slightly. So the parenthetical citation comes after the quotation marks and before the period. So it's going to look like this one on the right. So we ditch the S, and we just move it slightly, okay? So here the period actually becomes the very last thing in the sentence. And I don't imagine a lot of you are used to using citations. By and large, a lot of the papers look pretty good. The citations look better than I was expecting, so that's awesome. Maybe some of you saw the video at the beginning of the semester, so hopefully that helped. This is also something that's good that I've seen a lot of you do so far, and that's the 2-paragraph introduction. In Comp 1 or maybe even in high school, you're probably used to writing the, quote, 5-paragraph essay, right, where you have the 1-paragraph intro, 3 body paragraphs, and the 1-paragraph conclusion. But in Comp 2, we're going to write larger papers. I don't know how big this felt for some of you, but this is a very short paper compared to what we'll be writing later on in the semester. So you're going to need to get used to thinking about the introduction in a slightly different way. And I've seen several of you use a 2-paragraph introduction, which is great. And so I'll just read through this one real quick and kind of talk about it. When we're asked to create something from our own imagination, we each have our own voice. If an artist is pushed to create an imaginative painting, their view of their own imagination in the world shows through in their work. The same is true of writers. We may write a fictional tale about the death of a loved one. Our writing will reflect our experiences with death and loved ones, or possibly experiences of those close to us, and inevitably have an element of realism to it. This is certainly the case in Lori Moore's How to Become a Writer. In this short story, the main character, Francie, struggles with her journey into adulthood and developing her sense of self in the world and in her writings. Francie tends to put figurative realism in her imaginative stories, providing us a view of what dramatic events have influenced her writing voice. So first, the writing here is nice, and then the structure is cool too, right? So if we think about this, it's the same text here you've got. I just made it smaller so I can talk about it. But the first paragraph is kind of like the hook, right? Which is something that you want your paper to have, because you've got to get the reader's attention, right? And even though I'm the instructor and I have to read it, it helps if you have a hook to sort of make me more interested and make me more happy to read your paper. So this one, the hook here is a little bit more general, right? We're talking about creativity, imagination, and realism here in the arts in kind of a broad way. And then in the second paragraph, we start to zoom in a little bit, right? And now we go from imagination, creativity, and realism in the arts in general, and now we're focusing directly on the short story. So that's a nice example of a 2-paragraph introduction, and I had, this is the first one I came across, so I copied and pasted it, but there are a couple other ones that did basically the same thing. So this is a scheme that you might want to think about using in your papers as we go through the semester. Actually, this week we're reading the B.J. Holler's essays, right, about the monsters, and I think in at least a couple of them he has an entire section devoted to an introduction, right? And that might be something that when we get down to the research paper you might want to do yourself. So instead of having even just a 2-paragraph introduction, you might have an entire section. Okay, short story titles. Here's our text from the paper. How to Become a Writer is a process analysis on how to write, taught from a different angle. Very true. The quote here has how to become a writer in both italics and quotation marks. Short story titles belong in quotation marks. You don't need the italics, okay? So if you have a piece of writing inside a larger work, so a poem inside a book of poems, a short story inside a book of short stories, a chapter within a book, an article inside a newspaper, an article inside a magazine, all of the smaller things get quotation marks and the larger things get italics, okay? So, for example, this short story, How to Become a Writer, in quotation marks, you would find inside the book Self-Help, and the book would be italicized. So just one thing that'll be kind of important as you do your works cited pages as we go on throughout the semester. Yes, quotes within quotes. Okay. So here we have our text from the paper. At the end of each story, she likes to end it tragically, just like her train wreck career. About the second, you write a story about an old married couple who stumble upon an unknown landmine in their kitchen and accidentally blow themselves up. You call it For Better or Live or Worst. So here we have, the citation is done correctly. We have the end quotes, and we have more on page 4. So that's right, and it's inside the period, outside the quotation marks, so that's good. One thing we need to do, though, when we're talking about, because this is a short story that Francie wrote, so even though it's maybe not published, we still need to capitalize the main words, right? So, for better or live or worst, we wouldn't capitalize the conjunction or here in the middle, but we would capitalize everything else. And then, because it's a short story, we need to put it in quotation marks, so that's done correctly in a way, but where is this short story being referred to? Well, it's actually being referred to inside of quoted material already. So we've already used our big quotes on the outside, so we need to use single quotes for this thing. And so we'll show you that on this next page. So, for better or live or worst. And it looks like I actually screwed this up. So this one should be a single quote. Then we have the single quote, and then we have the double quote, which is ending the entire piece of quoted material, right? So we'll just pretend that I did this correctly. I'll sort of cover one of them with the mouse. So we have single quote, title, single quote, double quote to end the whole thing. And then our citation stays the same. Okay, using brackets for clarification. Now this can be kind of tricky. And I saw a lot of you writing about the short story, How to Become a Writer. I love that story, so it's awesome to get a bunch of papers about it. But it's kind of tricky, right? Because it's narrated in the second person, which means it uses the pronoun you. And when we write papers, we write them in the third person, right? And so when you're using quoted material from that story, it seems a little awkward. So here's the text from the paper. Later, Francie describes 3 traumatic events in her recent life when asked to write from personal experience. Think about what has happened to you. In 3 years, there have been 3 things. You lost your virginity, your parents got divorced, and your brother came home from a forest 10 miles from the Cambodian border with only half a thigh, a permanent smirk nestled into the corner of his mouth. Sorry if you can hear my baby crying through the monitor. So because of the pronoun you, in the text, we're talking about Francie in the third person, right? So the quote begins, or the text from the paper begins, later Francie describes 3 traumatic events. So Francie is a third person. We're referring to her in the third person. But then the quote reverts to the second person. And so that can be really kind of tricky. So we can use brackets to change the pronouns, and the brackets indicate to the reader that we're changing something and that it's the author of the paper, it's us changing it, not the actual author of the quoted material. So if we take a look here, I've bolded that over here. And I cut like the first sentence in half because I think we could sort of trim that out to be a little bit more efficient. So in 3 years, there have been 3 things. She lost her virginity, her parents got divorced, and her brother came home from a forest 10 miles, etc., etc. So now we have third-person pronouns that are still agreeing. That's our grammar word, right? That still agree with the third-person proper noun of Francie here. So that's one thing you can do. If you were writing this in your own paper, you wouldn't bold it. I'm just doing that to sort of draw your attention to it. But you would use the brackets to indicate that you, the writer of this paper, are changing something in order to maintain the grammatical integrity of the text. Block quotes. I feel like the video is going a little bit long, so I'm not going to read everything here. But we have the text from the author of the paper leading into the block quote. So we talked about parenthetical citations earlier when they come inside text that's embedded in the paper. Block quotes work a little bit differently. So block quotes do go outside of the entire chunk of text here. We don't have the author's last name. In this case, that's okay because I'm taking this quote out of context. But elsewhere in the paper, the author of that paper had already referred to Lori Moore before and had a citation like Moore 1017. And so once you've used the author's last name once, and if you're not referring to any other work, all you need is the page numbers. You don't have to say Moore 1017, Moore 1018, Moore 1019. You can just say 1017, 1018, 1019 in your subsequent citations. And when you use a block quote, you don't need quotation marks, right? Because we're setting it off visually, and so that gives us our clue. So one thing that this did not do, though, is that it's not indented, and that's what I wanted to show you in the next slide. So we have the author's text here, and then we have the quoted material. No quotation marks, and it's indented. The citation looks good. You will see that there's a quotation mark here, but that really belongs to like a quote inside of the quote. So this is not actually ending or indicating that the quote is ending. It's just a quote inside the quote. But other than that, the block quote was executed pretty well. I see this from time to time. It's great that you feel like connected with these writers, but they're not our BFFs, right? So instead of saying something like Lori says and then your quote, let's try to use the last name. So Moore says, make up anagrams of his own girlfriend's name, etc., etc. And then whenever you have a dialogue or a tag like that that leads into a quote, we want to follow it with a comma. So Moore says, comma. You can see that on the next page. But yeah, it's proper convention to use a last name instead of a first name, especially in the types of papers you'll be writing this semester. Okay, so that's all I've got for now. Hopefully the video didn't run too long, and I hope that this helped a little bit. I know writing the research papers can be, or writing from sources, because we're going to have a couple of different papers before we get to the research paper. But writing from sources can be a little tough, and the formal stuff can really trip you up more than sort of the argument. So I hope this helps. Thanks.